Hello world, it's Calcutron here with the 13th episode of our TI Basic tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to be learning about a new data type, the list. Now, this episode and the next will be spent on the calculator home screen and not the program editor, but I assure you that everything we do here on the home screen works just as well in your TI Basic program editor. Let's get started. Lists are a new data type for us, but they're also a new data structure. A data structure keeps some amount of data formatted in some organized way. For lists, much like arrays and other programming languages, this means that our data is indexed by ascending integers. So don't worry if what I just said was confusing. It'll hopefully make more sense when we start using lists. We're going to start by making a list literal using curly braces. Now within our curly braces, we put the data that we want to store in the list, so we can put in numbers, like 0, we can have duplicates, we can have 2 zeros, we can have negative numbers, and we can have decimal points on our numbers, and then whenever we're done, we just hit the end curly brace, and the curly braces you find as second functions of the parentheses. So now we have a list literal, and if we evaluate it, it just gives it back to us. So we know that this evaluates to that list literal, which has a 0, and a negative 1.23. Now, I've used the term data type a few times in this video already, and what a data type is it's information about some value that tells the calculator what operations are valid on it. So the first data type we learned was the real type, which are just numbers like 3 or 2.71. Technically, they're more like rational numbers than real numbers, but I won't tell if you won't. Knowing that a value is a real tells the calculator that we can add and multiply it with another real. So that is a valid operation because both of our things are real numbers. Well, now I'm introducing our second data type, which is the list. Lists have their own operations that the calculator will allow us to do, and we're going to explore a few of those today. As you can see, lists are just sequences of numbers, which are the list elements. Elements of a list, however, must be real numbers. In other programming languages, you might be able to do something that looks like this. So you can have a list and start putting your numbers in it. And then within that list, you can put in another nested list. So you could do something like this in a programming language like Java. But this won't work in TI Basic. If we execute it, it tells us we have an error, because the elements of a list must themselves be real numbers. So in this case, the second element on our list, the thing after the 0, is itself a list, which isn't a real number, and so we get a syntax error. So lists are only really useful if you assign them to a variable. You might think that you can just store it into any of the variables we've used so far, such as if you did 0, 1, 2, 3 stored in A, but that's not going to have the intended effect. That's because on the calculator, the variables have a data type. The letters A through Z and some other ones are real variables. If we want to use list variables, we have to find them in the list menu, which you can get to by hitting second and then stat, and up pops this menu. And you can see in this names tab is where all of the lists we can use right now are located. There's also an ops tab, which is operations, and then a math tab. We're going to stick to names for today, and we're going to just use L1, and let's get this A out of here. So now we can store our list 0, 1, 2, 3 into L1. And here we go, we have our list 0, 1, 2, 3 in L1, and we can see L1 has 0, 1, 2, 3 in it. Now, the most useful operation on a list, or one of the most useful operations, is list access. And we access elements of a list by hitting second stat again to get to the names. And then after the name of the list, we put an open parenthesis and then the index of the element that we want to access in the list. So I said at the beginning that lists are accessed by ascending integers. Well, what that means is that the first element in our list is going to be this 0 right here, and we access it with the index 1. And if we do that, we get our 0. And then ascending, so increasing, we get the next element of our list, 1, is at the index 2, and then the next element of our list, 2, is at our index 3. So we could have anything in our list. It doesn't have to be 0, 1, 2, 3. It could be 7, 4, 8, 11. And we can store this into list 2, how about? So I just thought it might have been confusing to have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 in our list. And now what we can do is list 2 at 1, and that will give us the first thing, which is the 7. Or list 2 at 4 will give us the 11. In addition to accessing elements of a list, we can also write to them. So the way we do that is a lot like we do with variables. We put the number we want to store, the real number, and remember this has to be a real number. It can't be a list or a string or a matrix. It has to be a real number. And then we put the name of the list, so L2, how about? And then we put the index. And so let's just put it in index 2. And now if we look at L2 again, we see the thing in index 2, it used to be 4, but now it's a 51 in index 2, and we can do that for any of our indexes or our indices. So we can store a 1 in number 4. Now if we look at our list again, we see 75181. So another shortcut we can do to get to any of these list variables is, instead of going to the list menu, hitting second list, if it's any of these L1, L2 through L6, then there's actually a shortcut on the keyboard or on the keypad, and it corresponds with the number pad keys. So the number pad keys 1 through 6 have the second function of bringing up this list. So if we hit second and then 2, we get our L2, and that will just make your life a lot easier. The next thing we can do is we can grow our list by putting things one outside of the indices that we already have defined. So right now we have defined index 1, index 2, index 3, and index 4. We haven't defined index 5. We can define index 5 by storing a number into it, and that will create a new element in our list. So now in list 2 we have 5 elements, so it grew. Sadly, we're not going to learn how to make it shrink in this episode, but stay tuned for the next one. So the other thing we can do is what I was showing you earlier, where I think I actually typed this out. What this would do is, if you ran it, it would actually run, and that might be surprising because you know that A is a real variable, not a list variable, and if you look at A, you'll see it is still a real variable, and it contains the value it contained before we ran this. And so you might be puzzled because there was no error message at all. So what's actually happened is you're creating a list with that as its name. So lists can actually have names that are up to 5 letters long. So in order to see this A, we can't type second and then numpad key A, because there's no numpad key for A. So there's no shortcut on the keyboard for it. We have to go back into the list menu, and you'll see now we have our list A down here. And if we look in list A, it has exactly what we just stored in it. So it's not at all connected to the real variable A. It is a new list. And if you want probably a better way to look at and edit your lists with letter and number names, you should go to the stat menu. So don't hit second before hitting stat, and you'll get the actual stat menu. And if you hit edit here, you'll get this nice menu. And you can see we have L1, L2 through L5. And then we can put in a new list. If we go over here and we hit enter, now we're in that prompt on the bottom, and we can enter a name like hello. And it can only be 5 characters long, and you can make characters in the middle numbers. You can make these numbers, but you can't make the first one a number. If you try to do that, it will tell you it's a syntax error, but if you leave the first one as not a number, you can make any of the subsequent characters numbers. So now we have our list hello spelled with 2 1s in it, and we can put in elements in here. Now, one thing you can't do, and it's easy to see that you can't do this here, but if you were trying on the home screen and you wanted to use your list hello, and you see it has 2 elements in it, you might think, well, what if I want to instantly grow my list to have 5 elements? You might think you can go ahead and do something along these lines, like 0 stored in hello at 5, and if you try to do that, you're going to get an invalid dimension. So you can only do it 1 greater than the current length of the list, and the current length or dimension of the list is 2. So if you put 1 more than 2, you can set that element and it will grow your list, and you can grow it out to be 5 long by doing this. And now you see it has 5 elements in it, but we can't instantly make it have a dimension of 5 without doing some things that we'll learn about in the next episode. So I hope you learned something and you enjoyed this episode today. Don't forget, a couple new buzzwords you learned were data type and data structure. Those are good words to know. Anyways, if you had any questions or concerns, please leave them below. Hope you enjoyed. Bye-bye.